Hello, welcome to LinkedIn News Live. I'm Nina Melendez. Today we are talking about authenticity, specifically authenticity at work. We're often told to be ourselves, but many times job success still depends on how well we can conform to our organization. My next guest says that even when talking about diversity and inclusion, employees can feel forced to choose between diversity or inclusion. But he is here to help. Joining me now is Kenji Yoshino. He is a professor of law at New York University. He is also on the advisory boards for diversity and inclusion at Charter Communications and Morgan Stanley, among others. He's a faculty director of the Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging at NYU. He attended Harvard, Oxford, and Yale. Kenji, welcome so much to the show.
Nina, thank you so much for having me.
It's so great to have you. So just for starters, when we talk about authenticity, what exactly are we talking about?
Yeah, authenticity is, I think, the very commonsensical view that you shouldn't have to be one person at home and another person at work. So authenticity means being able to bring your whole and true self to whatever environment you walk into.
But what about the idea that we have different personalities for different social situations? I mean, the person I'm with my sister is not the same person I'm going to be with my boss. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I guess I don't have any kind of brief to carry against that. It's your own choice, Nina. So if you want to be one person to your sister and then another person to me, that's of course your prerogative to do that. What I'm really trying to take aim at in my work is when organizations say to people, you have to tamp down or downplay things about yourself at work that may be A, very important to you, and B, sort of not consistent with the organization's own values of inclusion. So what I see over and over again is that an organization will say, we want you to bring your full self to work. We don't want you to downplay your identity as a woman or as a gay person or as an Asian person or as a Black person or what have you. But then there are these subtle cues that actually send a very different message about how individuals may need to code switch in exactly the way that you described, being oneself at home, but then having to leave a lot of themselves at the office door.
Being oneself and being professional, sometimes it can be, they don't necessarily reconcile. And if professionalism changes and varies depending on the industry you're in or perhaps the country you're in, how does one adapt to that? Or should one? Or does that mean that one isn't being oneself?
Yeah, it's a really important point. And, I think my work is often misunderstood as saying, oh, if I came and worked for you at LinkedIn tomorrow, Nina, and, it's completely obnoxious to everybody around you. And you said, kind of knock it off. And I said, well, this is actually my true self. This is my authentic self. So you can't require me to conform on that basis. Obviously, that's not what I'm talking about. That's not a workplace in which any of us would choose to live. So this notion that we have to downplay or cover aspects of ourselves is something that is quite nuanced. And it requires us to ask, is there an organizational value that is behind the covering demand? So if there's an organizational value that says, we don't want you to talk politics at work, or Kenji, we don't want you to be obnoxious at work, right? Then I think that it's perfectly legitimate for you to ask me to assimilate in those ways. And if I don't like that, I can either fight the value in the workplace and say we should change our values, Nina, or I should leave and find a workplace that's more conducive, to my own way of being, right? What I'm really taking aim at in my work, though, is that in organization after organization after organization, organizations are talking a certain talk, but not walking the walk. So organizations will say out of one side of their mouths, we believe in inclusion and we believe in authenticity on grounds of religion or race or sexual orientation or gender. But on the other hand, they're imposing what I call these covering demands of saying, no, we actually don't want to see that. Don't bring your same-sex partner to this work function. Don't talk about your children at work. Hide the paraphernalia that allows you to function as an individual with a motor function disability. And it's really that disconnect that I'm trying to challenge. The other stuff is harder, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit here where organizations are saying, yes, we really believe in this, but they're not translating that into allowing individuals the choice right, to uncover their full selves at work.
Kenji, I'm so glad you clarified, because prior to this, I got a lot of comments, and it was talking about, well, if I am, brash or, obnoxious, that this is just who I am, and that's not what we're talking about. I actually want to bring up a full screen of several ways that you recommend that people can be authentically themselves. If you want to put this up, you have three bullets here. And this, by the way, for our viewers, is part of Kenji's LinkedIn learning course, which I highly recommend. It was absolutely fascinating. How to be authentically you at work. The first one is think of a personal story consistent with the organization's values of inclusion. Make any necessary adjustments to make it professional, and then consider sharing the story during a meet and greet or something like that. Kenji, can you tell us why this method works?
Yeah, so this is actually based on a series of initiatives that a variety of organizations have adopted. So I'm thinking here of, this is now an oldie but goodie now, but Deloitte's Share Your Story initiative, but also Microsoft Stories of Us, right? And what those initiatives are based on is this notion that when you are a leader in an organization in particular, other people are looking to you to figure out what kinds of behaviors are acceptable in the workplace. And so if you're particularly a leader of a team or a leader of an organization, it's so important for you to share your story. So this is not, Nina, too much information or kind of telling more than people want to hear. We still want to make adjustments for the fact that it's a professional environment. You're not talking to a counselor. You're not talking to your best friend. You're not talking to your spouse. But nonetheless, if you just try this sometime, those of you who are managers and leaders, and maybe even those brave souls who are not, if you just color outside of the bounds of a traditional resume and just add something about yourself that isn't captured in that narrative, you'll be amazed at how much warmer and smaller and more psychologically safe your environment, your team, your institution, your culture will be the minute after you tell that story. So those narratives generate counter narratives. So, you just gave my resume and you were very kind and said, here are all the schools that I attended. But if I said to you, I'm a gay man, I'm married to my husband very happily now for 12 years. You see in the background are two wonderful children who are sort of 9 and 8. And we just took them to their first day of 4th grade and 3rd grade, respectively. Oh, I just got their ages wrong. They're 10 and 9. So pardon me for that. But I hope that actually gives you a sense of humanity, right? So think about how you felt about me after you sort of saw Harvard, Oxford, Yale, right? And before I told you that story, now, think about me as somebody who can't even remember his children's age, who took them to school this morning, who's sort of glowing with pride about the fact that they're entering a new school year. Do you feel better or worse about me? Do you feel like you can relate to me more or less? Do you feel like your own stories are more or less welcome? And then really importantly, do you feel like I have less authority, right? Given that you know me a little bit better? Generally, the answer to that story is no, right? So for those leaders who are worried, oh, if I'm vulnerable in this way, I'm going to sort of spend down some of my credibility. The social science is actually behind the idea that if we're actually more human in the workplace, it actually doesn't diminish our authority. It actually amplifies or cements it.
The first thing I wanted to say was, oh, first day of school, that's exciting. What did they wear? Did they have backpacks on? So absolutely, the reaction was different than, of course, hearing how you're about your impressive resume. I do want to ask, though, some people worry that perhaps if they speak out against organizational directives that say don't align with their values or with what they think, that there will be retribution. Couldn't one just say, well, it's not a good fit? If your values don't align with organization's values, like maybe it's just not a good fit. How would you advise managers or organizations on how to approach this?
Yeah, so again, it goes back to the core values proposition of what are the organization's values. So if the organization is literally saying, like, we don't care about the inclusion of women and we don't care about the inclusion of caregivers, and so if you have kids, then we want you to downplay that at work. If that organization is really saying that, then that certainly wouldn't be the organization I would want to work in. And so I'd start to think, is this really a good fit? Are there enough other things keeping me here? That I shouldn't just walk out the door and find another organization. But again, what we're talking about, Nina, in the vast run of cases, like we did a survey in conjunction with Deloitte, and every single organization that we surveyed said we believe in inclusion on the basis of gender. But every single one of those organizations had women in it who were reporting out, I have to downplay or cover my childcare responsibilities at work. So again, there's a disconnect between the value and the lived experience of the individuals inside them. Now, you bring up a really good point when you say, well, what about that individual woman who is saying, I'm worried about retaliation. I'm worried that if I speak up about this value, that I'll get, harmed in some way or retaliated against in some way. And that's why it's really important to have allies, right? Which I have a separate talk on LinkedIn on about the importance of allies, because we know that allies can speak up without incurring the same kind of penalties as directly affected groups do. But if the ally does speak up, the conditions should be there for a receptive hearing of that claim, because the organization has already committed itself at a higher level of generality to being inclusive with regard to gender and caregiving responsibilities. And so this isn't the kind of thing where it should be a tough sell of saying to the organization, like, you should have these different values. The claim is rather, you already have these values. It's just that you're living under those values rather than living up to those values. So let's try to work together to help you live up to the commitments that you've already made.
How do we keep organizations accountable?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is this notion of values conversations, right? So the values forcing conversation is a big part of what it means to uncover talent, in my phrase. And so one of the sort of questions that I ask of you, in the LinkedIn Learning course is to just go through a decision tree of saying, is this, covering demand, the demand that you downplay certain aspects of your identity, harmful to you, right? If it's not, then you're one of the lucky ones. So no harm, no foul, no further action required. If it's harmful, then it goes to the earlier part of our conversation. Does the organization have a value, right, that can legitimately be deployed to ask you to cover, to justify that covering demand? If the answer to that is yes, then maybe it's not a good fit and maybe that you need to go to another organization. But if the answer is yes, it harms me, and no, the organization doesn't have a value that would justify the demand, at that point, you should be able to have the values forcing conversation with the organization saying, you say in all of your materials, you say, out of the mouths of leaders, you say that this is a core value, but there's a disconnect. And this is something that is not done usually with ill intent. It's just that, there's a slip, right, in between what we think of as diversity and inclusion, which is actually too often diversity or inclusion. So people often talk about diversity and inclusion, but what they mean is diversity or inclusion. In other words, I can bring my fully authentic self to work and be fully diverse, but risk exclusion. Or alternatively, I can tamp down or edit or downplay or cover the things that make me different from the dominant groups in the workplace, and I can be accepted, but always at sufferance and only at the cost of doing that work. So once organizations that are talking about diversity and inclusion are told they're only doing diversity or inclusion, in our experience at our center, once you show that gap, and we have a lot of data to show this gap, right? There's this big aha where people say, oh my goodness, we have all these policies, just to give you some data points, that include people on the basis of race and ethnicity, but 79% of Black respondents reported covering, right? We have all these policies that say we believe in LGBT inclusion, but 83% of LGBT respondents said that they had to cover at work. And then we had another battery of questions that said, if this covering demand is occurring, does it actually hurt? And 60 to 73%, depending on the axis of covering, said that this was somewhat to extremely detrimental to their sense of self. 53%, last data raft of statistics, 53% said their leaders expected them to cover, and of that, 50% said that this covering demand from leaders somewhat to extremely diminish their commitment to the organization. That last data point is probably the one I should have led with, Nina, because that's the talent case, right? If you're looking for where your talent is either browning out or burning out of an organization, right, in terms of its commitment, that's a really good place to look, because 53% of 50% is a really big number indeed for an organization.
I really want to dig into the concept of covering, and we've got a full screen for that. Before we go to that, I want to say hi to some of the members joining us. Looks like from around the world, Kenji, people are very interested. Anna from Romania, Dolores from Texas. Dolores, good to see you again. Kelly from New York. And we've got a couple comments. James says, I'm different depending on who I'm with, but my morals and values are the same. So I guess I'm being consistent in that way, which is the most important thing. James, thanks for your comment. Christy has a question for you, Kenji. She asks, do you have any advice on disclosing you're in recovery? This is interesting. A lot of people who have illnesses, perhaps they're not visible illnesses or they're not visible disabilities. What is to Christy's question, what is a good way to do that?
Yeah, so great. So if I may actually riff off of James's comment too, I think this really helpfully ties back to what you were saying earlier about how you're one person to your sister, but it's actually normal and human, right, for you to be a different person to me or a different person at work. And James is saying an analog of that and saying, look, I may adjust, myself in various contexts, but I still feel true to my core values. And I would say that's wonderful, right? Like, this is not what I'm criticizing. What I'm criticizing is not covering performances. Like, I don't want to look at you or look at James or have anyone look at me for that matter and say, oh, Kenji's like covering his sexual orientation and he's doing this or he's doing that, because I just don't want people sort of psychoanalyzing me in the workplace. What I want to focus on is not covering performances, but rather covering demands, right? I want to look at the organization that says either explicitly or implicitly, Kenji, it's fine that you're gay, but don't bring your husband to a client dinner, right? Because the client's really conservative. That's what I'm taking aim at, right? Because oftentimes organizations have this value of inclusion at some level of generality, but then don't sort of walk the walk. And then with regard to the wonderful question about when to disclose various sort of issues of recovery, or if I can extend that a little bit, a lot of the really interesting data in our study came up about sort of mental or physical disability or illness, oftentimes things that were invisible, right? And so one of the key findings in our survey was that 45% of straight white men reported covering along one dimension. So even the most ostensibly privileged cohort in the workplace covered, right, at a very, very high level. And so again, there's a difference between that 45% of straight white men who covered and the 79% of Black respondents or the 83% of LGBT respondents who reported covering. But nonetheless, 45% is the plurality of this ostensibly most privileged cohort. And when you dig into that, because that was startling to me, I used to think of straight white men as being on the outside of the diversity inclusion paradigm looking in. This showed me that straight white men are squarely in the soup and they're covering along with the rest of us. And this is truly a project of universal human flourishing and authenticity in the workplace that will benefit everybody, not just minority groups. The reason I was sort of triggered into going on that tear off of this wonderful question is that one of the top ways in which individuals who are straight white men reported covering was on this issue of mental or physical illness, even including things like stigmatized issues like recovery and addiction. And I feel like we're finally having that national conversation about it, right? So I guess what I would want to say is, like, for me, there's a kind of wholesale retail thing of, I don't want to tell any of our listeners to put themselves in harm's way, potentially by saying, oh, you say that, you are going to be inclusive of, addiction issues. And so, therefore, I'm going to come out to you as somebody who's in recovery and expect that you will treat me the same way, right? I want you to be sort of very cautious about that. But what I want to do is sort of attack that at the wholesale level, if you will, to say to the organization, right, as allies, as external organizations like, my own organization or LinkedIn itself, this is a major issue, right? This should not be stigmatized. This is something where some of the most heroic people we know, right, fell into, addiction for reasons that were beyond their control, and then are being amazing and, trying to support their own recovery and the recovery of others. And so why would we want to stigmatize them? Why wouldn't we want them to, find support within the workplace rather than having to, carry that entire burden on their own and not only have to deal with recovery, but have to deal with keeping the recovery a secret, right? So, this is something very near and dear to me as a member of the LGBT community, because it's something that, LGBT issues are really hidden, right? Subordinated identities. And so I do feel like it's a double burden, not only to have the stigmatized identity, but also to have to keep it a secret. So, I'm a big advocate of trying at the wholesale level to get organizations to change their values. Once the organization has shifted to state that value, then it's time for individuals to, hopefully allies, not the individuals themselves, to argue that the gap should be closed in between the ideal and the reality.
Are people is recovery or are people who struggle with addiction? Is any of that covered by law? I mean, you would know. You're
Yeah,
a lawyer.
It's actually it's actually state by state. So there's no federal law, to my knowledge, that protects it, right? And so you have the kind of variegation in our federalist system of different jurisdictions doing different things. But if I can make this a little bit more personal, right? 10 years ago, students used to come shaking in my office with their resumes saying, "Can I put LGBT on my resume, or will I get hurt by it when I go on the job market?" And I used to say, such a deeply personal decision. I'm not here to tell you what to do, but I will ask a question, which is, when do you want people to know? Because you actually hold the cards. You have the power now. Do you want people to know here at the port of entry where the cost of going somewhere else are very low? Or do you want people to know when you're 7 years into a partnership track, right? The reason, again, that I raise that is to say, not to draw any kind of parallelism between LGBT identity and recovery issues other than this. Both are invisible identities. So now the conversation has moved where, thankfully, at least in New York, many fewer LGBT students, vanishingly small number, actually come to me with that question. But now the people who have replaced them are people who say, "I'm in recovery," right? I have this other invisible stigma, right, pertaining to mental health or mental illness issues. When should I disclose, right? And I say, again, very personal issue. I'm not going to give you advice on something that's so personal to you, but I will ask the question of when you want people to know.
You sit on the board of many Fortune 500 companies. When you are advising on things like diversity and inclusion, what is one of the main things that comes up in these conversations?
Yeah, what's really heartening about all of this is that people have gotten so much more sophisticated about this. It used to be simply diversity, right? Of just like bean counting and looking at numbers of people in particular demographic groups. And what I really love about how the conversation has evolved is that, about a decade ago, again, I saw the conversation moving really decisively from diversity to inclusion, of people understanding that there's no point in getting a whole bunch of diverse people into a room and then making them all act the same, right? So diversity without inclusion is actually not really that helpful, because for starters, you're not going to retain the diversity that you have unless you feel like people have a sense of belonging, right? But you're not going to get the value of that diversity, because study after study has shown that diverse perspectives, create better products, more innovation, create a better pipeline for talent, and just benefit workplaces in terms of their bottom line. And so why would you want to allow your similarity bias take over? Similarity bias is a like bias, right? And to say everyone can look different, but actually has to behave in exactly the same way. So about a decade ago, Nina, I saw the conversation moving from diversity to diversity and inclusion. And now, much more recently in these organizations, I'm again heartened to see that the language has shifted to belonging, right? Because the question of inclusion still raises a really troubling, sort of nettlesome question of who is including whom, right? So there's still the dominant group and the subordinated group, and the dominant group is kind of out of noblesse oblige, sort of including the subordinated group. And so that's not a great paradigm for anybody, right? So what I like to do, and what I endorse these organizations for doing, is to keep the end goal in mind, which is to say belonging is really the end goal. And we define belonging. My center is called the Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, very self-consciously, because we wanted to get that word belonging in there as the end state. Belonging is the state in which you feel like you have a stake in the organization and that the organization has a stake in you. And belonging is really the end goal of feeling like somebody really respects you. And unless you are authentic, you're not even giving people the chance to truly respect you, right? So if you said, Nina, I respect you, but I didn't think that you knew me that well because I was hiding something really important about myself, I might trust the respect, but I wouldn't trust the you. So I couldn't trust the whole sentence, right? So it's only when I feel like you really understand where I'm coming from, what motivates me, what my passions are, what my values are, and then you say, Kenji, I respect you, that really means something to me. And that's belonging, right? So the end state of belonging is sort of primal and bedrock. If you look at psychologist Abraham Maslow's famous hierarchy of needs, after your food and shelter needs are met, right? After your physical safety needs are met, the next need that you have, just as a human being, no matter where you are in the world, is belonging, the need to feel like you belong to something larger than yourself. And the organizations that are able to provide that to their employees are going to be ultimately successful. And many of the organizations that I work with, including the ones on whose boards I sit, have embraced that idea of diversity is not enough, even inclusion is not enough. What we really need to drive for is a sense of belonging for everyone.
I love that the conversation has moved in that direction, because it's true, just being let into the room isn't enough. Feeling like you deserve to be there and that you have a voice and that you are just as much a part of it as everyone else in the room is so important to being able to contribute and being yourself authentically. I want to bring up the covering concept that you've been mentioning. We've got a chart here to show to our viewers. The uncovering your authentic self at work, there are 4 axes of covering. Kenji, can you walk us through these and tell us what they mean?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. So, covering again is the pressure to downplay stigmatized identity at work. I'm often asked how this is different from passing. So I'd like to address that at the outset. When you're passing, people literally don't know that you belong to a particular group. When you're covering, people know you belong to the group, either because you're unable or unwilling to hide that, but nonetheless put a lot of pressure on you to, again, mute or downplay or edit that identity so that you're more acceptable to the dominant groups in the work environment. And I wrote a book on this about 15 years ago now, and I broke down covering along these 4 different axes of appearance, affiliation, advocacy, and association. Nina, you see my weakness for alliteration here, but hopefully you'll be able to put it to good mnemonic use. So appearance-based covering has to do with self-presentation, your grooming, attire, or mannerisms, and how people ask you to modulate that to blend into the mainstream. So a good example of this might be a person with a motor function disability, and we had lots of reports of this in our survey, unfortunately, who say, I'm actually much more physically comfortable in my wheelchair than I am with a cane, but I use the cane, even though that occasions much more physical pain, because the social discomfort of wheeling into the room is so significant that I downplay or cover the disability by using a cane, which is a much more common accommodation or piece of paraphernalia that people use in order to navigate space. Affiliation-based covering concerns how you avoid behaviors that are widely associated with the group, often to rebut or preempt unconscious biases that exist about the group. So a good example here might be a woman who downplays her caregiving responsibilities in order to make sure that everybody sees her as a fully committed worker. Unfortunately, there's a lot of social science data out there. I'm thinking about Stanford sociologist Shelley Carell's work about the motherhood penalty in particular, that says, if you and I, Nina, say the same thing, I just had a kid, very different things are going to happen to us on average, right? On average, I will get a pay hike and you will get a pay cut, because the unconscious bias that's triggered when a man says, I just had a kid, is, oh, Kenji's now a provider, we have to pay him more or he's going to leave for a competitor. Whereas the unconscious bias that's triggered when you say, I had a kid, is, oh, Nina's now a caregiver, she's going to get pulled out of the workplace by those caregiving responsibilities. And so it's actually, unfortunately, rational for any individual woman to cover. And that's why we need to address this at the systemic level of saying, let's flip these survey results back to you and show you how much talent you're losing because you're imposing this covering demand on women. This is not something that is morally defensible, nor is it defensible as a matter of the bottom line. Advocacy-based covering concerns how you avoid sticking up for your own group so you don't seem too militant or strident or activist. So, one of the examples that came up in our survey is like a veteran hears an anti-military joke in the elevator and, stands down and doesn't fight it, right? Even though he may have put his own life on the line for his country, right? Because he doesn't want to seem overly militant or strident, right? Or thin-skinned or unable to take a joke, right? And so, again, I just want to underscore that covering behaviors and demands can be directed at any group in society that's outside of the mainstream for that workplace. So you could be a straight white male service member, right, and still be subjected to that covering demand, of feeling like there's going to be some penalty. I'm going to be called a snowflake. I'm going to be called, hypersensitive or humorless if I, challenge that joke. And then last but not least, association-based covering concerns how much you sort of avoid hanging out with other group members, right? So this is the example I gave earlier of, you could be totally comfortable saying I'm gay in the workplace, but you might still think twice about bringing your same-sex partner to a work function with a client, right? In sort of more universal terms, this often shows up with regard to both formal and informal sort of interactions between individuals of the same group. So some of the most haunting sort of data points that we saw in our survey were things like, I'm Black and I'm very, very cautious about sitting next to another Black colleague at lunch or in a meeting. I'm very cautious about, talking to other Black people around the water cooler. And so you start digging at that point of saying like, wow, this is coming up a lot. Why is this? And then some of the data points really substantiated the why of it, because people said when more than 2 or 3 of us get together as Black individuals in this organization and have a water cooler conversation, someone will walk by and say something like, is this an NAACP meeting? Is this a Black Lives Matter protest? Are you starting a revolution, right? So shocking, right? That, and I mean, maybe I shouldn't be shocked, maybe that's naive, but I still am viscerally shocked and dismayed by that, right? And angry about that, because this is 2021. And the fact that 3 white individuals talking by the water cooler is just a conversation, but 3 Black people having the exact same conversation at the exact same water cooler is a protest, a revolution, or an NAACP meeting. It's just totally unacceptable, right? And so that's a kind of association-based covering that I think can resonate with many people. I think anyone can see that that is wrong, right? That is wrong to say out of one side of our mouth, we believe in inclusion on the basis of race in our organization or ethnicity. On the other hand, having all of these reports, like a flood of reports coming out from the Black community, the Latinx community, the Asian community, saying, I actually think twice before I sit next to another person of my own race in a meeting. I think twice about whether to go to lunch or to be seen going to lunch with another person. I even had a chief diversity officer who was supposed to be shadowing the incumbent chief diversity officer as the incoming chief diversity officer. And at a certain point, people made so many comments, confused them for each other and called them by each other's names. They just said, enough of this. So we're just going to synchronize our watches. We both need to work this room, but I'm going to go in first. 15 minutes later, you come into the room, and then we're going to engage in that form of association-based covering. So this is happening a lot in forms that are both really sort of poignant and common, right? And so that's association-based covering. So once you stack up those 4 A's, the appearance-based covering, affiliation-based covering, advocacy-based covering, and association-based covering, I hope that we have the kind of tools to start naming some of the behaviors that are the kind of second-generation forms of bias in the workplace. Very few organizations, really no organization, at least in the Fortune 500, is going to say, we don't hire, racial minorities in the workplace. Like, they get hit with the Title VII lawsuit in a hot second, if they said that. But many of the organizations say, of course we hire those individuals, still have these kinds of covering demands floating around in the workplace.
I think what's also fascinating about what you just said, Kenji, is thinking as individuals what we might think is, funny or a joke or something very lighthearted. How do we exclude our colleagues, or how do we not let our colleagues be themselves with these comments that we make that might be offhand and offensive and not be aware of it? Kenji, this conversation has had so many responses here on the LinkedIn stream. I just want to end with one. Belonging, from Tamika. Belonging is the key and end goal. No point to inclusion unless you can experience belonging. Tamika, thank you for that comment. And Kenji, thank you so much for joining us and breaking this down for us. It's been such a pleasure having you on.
Oh, Nina, the pleasure was all mine. Thanks so much for your hospitality.
And good luck to the kids on their first day of school.
Thank you. I'll convey that to them. We'll see how it went.
Bye-bye. That was Kenji Yoshino. He is a father too, and he is also a professor of constitutional law at New York University Law School. And thank you for everyone who participated in the comments. You can continue the conversation here. Or you can check out some of our other stories on the news module to the right of your feed, or if you're on LinkedIn, you can check out, if you're on mobile, you can check out the app. And also, please check out Kenji's LinkedIn learning course on this subject. For tomorrow, we have a very special show for you. We are honoring the 20th anniversary of 9/11 with a look at how the events that day forever changed the lives and career journeys of so many people. You won't want to miss that show. I'm Nina Melendez. Thank you for watching LinkedIn News Live.